Welcome to a night America tried to forget. A night when the river itself seemed to hold its breath, when the air over the Mississippi turned heavy, too still, too knowing, and somewhere beyond the sugar fields, the sound of drums began to rise. Slow, steady, alive. Before we begin, take a moment wherever you're watching from. Type the place, the hour, the minute. Because when you share it, you're not just watching history, you're standing inside it. It's January 1811. The German coast of Louisiana, a narrow, fertile strip of land running along the river, dotted with sprawling plantations and cabins made of rough-hewn cypress. By day, the world here moves to the rhythm of work songs and whip cracks. By night, to the whisper of plans that no overseer was meant to hear. For months, the whispers had spread, carried from cabin to cabin, from field to field. A word passed in Creole, in broken English, in prayer Freiheit, liberté, freedom. A word so dangerous that even the wind hesitated to carry it. But tonight, they were done whispering. Picture it. Men wrapped in rags, feet hardened by the soil they never owned. Women clutching children faces, lit only by the dull orange glow of torches made from soaked cane. Behind them, the cabins creak in the night wind, those wooden boxes of sleep and sorrow. Ahead of them, New Orleans, 50 miles downriver, and the promise of something no one alive among them had ever seen: freedom born from fire. The overseers will call it madness. The newspapers will name it terror. But for those who marched, it was neither. It was deliverance raw, unfiltered, and burning like cane set to flame. They had no uniforms, no muskets, no flags, only tools turned into weapons, and faith turned into courage. Some would die before sunrise. Others would vanish into swamps so deep that even time forgot their names. But for a few hours before the guns came, before the history books closed, Louisiana's enslaved rose up, and the South looked into the mirror of its own fear. Close your eyes. Listen. Can you hear the rustle of cane leaves, the soft thud of bare feet on wet soil? The low hum of a song, maybe a prayer, maybe a war cry blending with the sound of the river. That's the rhythm that still echoes in these fields, even 2 centuries later. This isn't just another forgotten uprising. It's the night the enslaved fought to rewrite the story of America, and history tried to burn the pages. This is the rebellion they tried to erase. And it began here on the banks of the Mississippi, under a moon that saw everything and told no one. The land was quiet before the storm, but the silence even then felt wrong. The Mississippi moved slow that winter, heavy and swollen from the rains. Its surface carried no reflection, only the dark shimmer of a river that had seen too much a river that remembered. This was the German coast, where sugar ruled, and the people who harvested it lived without names. Stretching upriver from New Orleans, the plantations lined both sides like mirrors of each other. Grand white houses facing the water, while behind them, rows upon rows of cabins sank into the mud and shadow. Between those two worlds lay a distance that could not be measured in miles. Each dawn began the same. The overseer's horn, the crack of the whip, the rustle of bodies rising before the light had even reached the fields. They moved through fog that smelled of earth, of rot, of sweat, left to dry on torn fabric. The cane rose taller than a man, thick, sharp-edged, whispering with every gust of wind, as if warning them of something coming. And yet, beneath that monotony, a pulse had begun to form. It was not loud, not yet, but it moved like blood through the soil. A secret rhythm shared in glances and songs, hummed low enough to escape the overseer's ear in messages carved into wood or hidden in hymns that sounded like prayer, but meant something else. The air itself seemed to change that January, thicker, restless, like the world was waiting for a match to be struck. Those who lived in the great houses felt it too, though they would never admit it. They tightened patrols, counted tools, whispered at dinner about rumors the Africans are talking again, the new ones from Saint-Domingue, the ones who fought in the islands. Because Louisiana was not like the rest of America. Here, the memory of Haiti burned like a fever. The story of enslaved men who became soldiers of sugar fields, that turned into battlegrounds of masters, fleeing with nothing but their lives. And some of those who fled Haiti had come here and brought with them not just their wealth, but their fear. They built new plantations, tried to bury the past beneath rows of cane, but the soil of the Mississippi carried its own memory. And the Africans, they bought many of them from the same islands, the same wars remembered too. In the cabins, the nights were long and filled with whispers. The men who had once cut cane in the Caribbean told stories of generals who had been slaves. They spoke of Toussaint, of Dessalines, of men who made the white armies run. Those names moved through the darkness like forbidden prayers. Somewhere along the river, a man named Charles Deslandes began to listen and to dream. He was what they called a driver, a trusted slave placed between the master and the field. He could move between cabins, talk to men, carry messages unnoticed. And in that fragile space between obedience and rebellion, something began to form. By December of 1810, the signs were there for anyone who knew how to look. Groups of men lingering after dark, their voices hushed. A sudden shortage of blades of small tools that could cut more than cane. New songs appearing, songs that sounded like praise, but carried maps and warnings within their verses. Still, to the masters, it was unthinkable. The slaves might steal, might run, but revolt, that was madness. But the land knew better. The wind carried the scent of something smoldering, not yet flame, but ready. In the mornings, mist hung over the fields like smoke. The children were quiet. The dogs barked at nothing. The overseer's tempers grew short. Even the river boats that passed along the Mississippi seemed to move faster, as if trying to leave before something broke. And then came the full moon. The same pale light that once shone on Haiti now fell across Louisiana's fields, cold and sharp, catching on the blade of every cane knife, glinting in the eyes of men who no longer bowed their heads. Charles Deslandes was not alone. There was Cook from the Congo, Jupiter from the plantation upriver, Harry Gilbert Quamana, men who had lived their entire lives in bondage, but had carried somewhere deep within them the memory of being free. They met in the thickets, in the edges of the swamp, where the frogs drowned out their voices. They planned by firelight, tracing the river in the dirt, whispering names of those who would join when the signal came. It would begin at Andre Plantation. They decided the one where the master slept closest to the river, his rifles locked in a chest, his guards grown lazy. From there, they would move from plantation to plantation, gather more men, seize horses, weapons, and ride down toward New Orleans. The city would see them not as fugitives, but as an army of the enslaved. They didn't speak of surviving. They spoke of reaching, of seeing the city lights before dying, of making the world hear their noise before the silence returned. And so the stage was set. The land was a theater built from sweat and soil. The players, barefoot, nameless, unseen, waited behind the curtain of night. The script, unwritten, but inevitable. What they didn't know was that the eyes of the masters were already shifting, that fear was already creeping into the big houses like a draft through the walls. Some swore they heard drums where there were none. Others claimed to see lights moving in the cane at midnight. The rumor spread something is stirring upriver. And then one night, the river went still. The air froze. A single torch was raised, and everything changed. But that is not yet this moment. This is still the breath before the cry. The hush before history begins to scream. The records begin, as they always do, not with the voices of those who lived it, but with the ink of those who survived it. In the archives of Louisiana, in a courthouse that still smells of mildew and dust, the first report appears. Disturbance on the German coast. Slaves in open revolt. Multiple plantations attacked. It's dated January 9th, 1811. A single line, cold flat, stripped of breath. But between those few words lies a roar that history never wanted you to hear. Because before there was a report, there was a sound, the first crack of a door splintering under torchlight. There was a shout, not in English, not in the language of the master, but in something older, sharper, carried from Africa through the islands, through the years. Some said it sounded like prayer, others like thunder, and then chaos. Charles Delons leading dozens, then hundreds downriver barefoot, armed with cane knives and stolen muskets, their torches turning the dark into something alive. The plantations of André Trepagny, Kenner Macaulay, all erupted within hours. Those who had once bowed were now shouting, singing, striking. The rebellion spread like a fever that had waited too long to burn. Witnesses later claimed the rebels moved in formation, that they marched with rhythm, that they sang songs no one recognized. The papers called it barbarous. But what if it wasn't chaos at all? What if it was choreography, the memory of freedom expressed in motion and sound? The echoes of African war drums, reborn in the land that tried to silence them. When the sun rose, smoke coiled over the cane fields. Planters fled to New Orleans on horseback. Messages carried downriver by boat, the slaves are coming. Panic filled the salons and parlors of the city, women clutching pearls, men shouting orders. Militias assembled before breakfast, rifles shaking in their hands. No one knew how many were coming. Some said 50, some said 500. Others swore it was thousands. But the truth was less a number, more a force. They came in lines 2 by 2, drums pounding from their chests. They shouted liberty, a word borrowed from the revolution that America itself had betrayed. And for 36 hours, the Mississippi Valley belonged to them. Later, when the soldiers caught up, they called it a massacre. But in the fragments of the trial, transcripts still preserved in the state archives, you find another kind of truth. The judges wrote, Charles Deslondes, mulatto driver of the André plantation, presumed leader of the insurrection, executed and burned before the public. Heads of the executed placed upon poles along the river road for the space of 30 miles. 30 miles. 30 miles of silence and warning. The road to New Orleans turned into a gallery of terror. The same road those men had marched, now lined with their skulls. That was the official ending. But folklore never accepted that as the last word. Among the WPA slave narratives, written more than a century later, an old woman from St. John Parish told this. They say you still hear them, marchin' when the moon full. Just the sound of feet in the cane. No talkin', just walkin'. All them men what didn't make it to the city. And another, a man from Plaquemine, swore his grandfather saw lights moving through the fog like torches. But no fire, no men. He said the dogs won't go near the levee at night. He said the wind hums when it passes the poles. Folklore is memory that refuses to die, even when history tries to bury it. Still, the fact layer is merciless. Governor Claiborne in New Orleans wrote letters that still survive. The insurgents have been destroyed, their leaders executed, their remains exhibited as example. But between his lines, something cracks a tremor in the governor's tone. Because even he could not explain how hundreds of men unarmed barefoot could coordinate across 50 miles, through swamps, through patrols, through fear itself without being caught in the first hour. Something unseen moved them. Some said it was Charles's charisma, that he was half priest, half soldier. Others said it was the drummers' men from Africa's Congo Square who remembered the rhythms that could raise courage from the bones. But the elders whispered another story. They said the spirits of Haiti's dead had followed the refugees who fled to Louisiana, that the land here rich and wet remembered rebellion, like a seed remembers rain. They said every time the cane caught fire, the wind carried voices that weren't just the living. And when the uprising began, those voices marched too. There is one letter, almost never shown in textbooks, written by a French colonist to his brother in Baton Rouge, dated January 13th, 1811. The blacks rose in numbers beyond reason. I could not sleep for the noise. The ground itself seemed to move. We saw lights in the fields, where there should be none, and when we reached them, there were no torches, no men, only the cane burning from within. That letter was found years later in a chest half burned. The writer's plantation was gone. The folklore layer calls it the night of two fires, the one the men lit, and the one the land lit in return. In those tales told by descendants in parishes still bearing French names, the uprising is remembered not as failure, but as cleansing. The fire that didn't end the rebellion, it purified it, turned it into myth, made it immortal. They say Charles's body never burned, that the flames turned to ash around him, and that his shadow kept walking down the levee. Others say he appears before storms, when the river rises high to lead the drowned back to shore. To this day, some fishermen refuse to anchor near Andre Point. They claim to hear chanting from the fog when the water's still. The official record says the rebellion ended in 2 days. But the folklore says it never did. And yet, between fact and myth lies the cruelest truth, the silence that followed. The survivors, those who weren't killed outright, were forced back into the fields before the ashes cooled. The word freedom was erased from every tongue. Children born after were told never to speak of it. Even the graves were left unmarked, no stones, no names, just dirt and time. But the soil doesn't forget. The soil holds sound. And when you walk those roads today, near La Place Norco d'Estrehan, there's a strange hush. The traffic fades, the air thickens, and sometimes you feel the rhythm, like footsteps in the earth, faint, steady, endless. Archival researchers in the 1930s tried to trace the event, but many of their notes vanished. One WPA historian wrote, "Locals refused to speak." One man laughed and said, "Ain't no ghosts there, just folks who ain't done marching yet." And that might be the truest thing ever written about it, because what began as rebellion became haunting. And what was haunting became heritage. Every spiritual sung in the fields, every drumbeat in Congo Square, every protest song that followed, carried a piece of that night. The German Coast Rebellion didn't die. It changed form. It sank into the rhythm of a nation still pretending not to hear. In the records, they mark the uprising as a failure. But in the folklore, it's something else, a prophecy. That one day, the same rhythm would rise again in the fields, in the streets, in the songs. And perhaps that's why when the Mississippi swells during hurricane season, the locals say the river hums. Not from the wind, but from the march that never ended. The river didn't return to silence overnight. Even after the executions, after the heads on poles had begun to rot in the heat, the land refused to forget. Something in the air changed, as if every breath carried an echo of what had happened and what was still unfinished. The white planters spoke of restoration, of order returning. But at night, they barred their windows, doused their lamps, and whispered about noises drifting from the cane. Sometimes the clatter of wood. Sometimes a faint hum, like a song too low to name. And sometimes the unmistakable sound of feet. The German coast was never the same again. They said the fields were cursed, that tools rusted faster, that harvests failed without reason. Some blamed weather, others blamed bad seed. But the older ones, the ones who'd lived through it, only nodded in silence. They knew what it was. The land was remembering. A year later, a planter named Jean Trepanier filed a strange report in New Orleans. He wrote that one of his overseers, while patrolling the levee at dusk, had seen figures marching in the mist, hundreds of them all in line. The man fired his pistol, and the sound vanished into the fog. When he returned the next morning, there were footprints in the mud, bare human and leading nowhere. The report was dismissed as hysteria, a side effect of the uprising's trauma, but it wasn't the only one. In 1813, 2 ferrymen swore that torches had appeared near the river bend north of La Place, burning bright in the rain. When they called out, no one answered. When they rowed closer, the lights sank one by one, as if swallowed by the water. They never ferried that stretch again. And so began the stories, the mini cases that drifted through decades, passed from mouth to mouth, like contraband memory. The first case, the cabin that wouldn't stay empty. At Andre Plantation after the rebellion, the master ordered the cabin where Charles Deslandes had lived to be burned. But each time they tried, the flames died out. 3 times they soaked it in oil, 3 times the fire refused to catch. Finally, they tore it down by hand, plank by plank. A month later, on a night with no wind, the overseer's wife woke to see light flickering outside the outline of a cabin, standing in the dark hole again for a moment, before vanishing into smoke. The second case, the cane that bled. In St. John Parish, harvesters swore that when they cut certain rows of cane, red sap spilled from the stalks, not clear, not sweet, but thick, staining their hands. It stopped after one summer, but no one harvested those rows again. They called it Deslandes cane. Even the new owners, decades later, avoided that patch of soil. The third case, the child who remembered the march. In 1842, a boy born on the same land began to hum a song his mother didn't know. When asked, he said, "It's the march song." She asked who taught it to him. He said, "The men by the river." There were no men by the river. By the time he was 10, he refused to walk that way, again saying, "They're still going." That boy grew old. His descendants still live near Norco, and the melody, they say, has no known origin. Fact and folklore began to twist together until no one could tell them apart. Even the Freedmen's Bureau agents, decades later, after the Civil War, recorded testimonies that bled between memory and haunting. One 1866 report mentions a group of colored laborers refused to work past sundown, stating that the cane men walk then. They claim to hear orders in French shouted from the dark. And if you stand there now on that same soil, there's nothing but wind and highway. But the hum, if you let it, it seeps through the noise. Archival silence can be as loud as thunder. The trial records of 1811 list names, not full names, just fragments: Jupiter Quamana, George Andre's mulatto boy. Next to each, executed, executed, executed. No birth, no death, no note of family. History flattened them into numbers. But folklore gave them back faces. They say Jupiter had a scar from a blade fight in Saint-Domingue, that he once served in the army of Dessalines before being captured again. They say Quamana was a drummer whose rhythms carried coded messages down the river. And they say one of them, no one remembers who struck the first blow that night, shouting a word in his own tongue that no one wrote down. That was the moment, the old storytellers say, when the river itself shuddered as if answering back. Over the decades, these incidents kept surfacing like ghosts through the paper trail. In 1871, a group of Reconstruction-era soldiers stationed near Kenner reported strange lights in the swamp moving in lines in rhythm. One of them, Sergeant Willis, wrote in his diary, "No sound but the splash of water. But it felt like we were being watched. Not by men, but by something that remembered us." His diary was never filed with his regiment. It surfaced again in 1932 when WPA historians interviewed his grandson. The old man said he never went near the river again. Said the men from the cane were still marching, and that when he looked too long, one turned to look back. The folklore of the Phantom Regiment began to grow the idea that the souls of the rebellion had never stopped their march toward New Orleans. During storms, locals swore they could hear the beat of drums under the thunder. During floods, torches would appear, faint lights moving downstream, always in pairs, always silent. Priests tried to bless the riverbanks. Preachers sang hymns against the old songs. But nothing stopped the stories. And in a way, those stories became a kind of resistance. Because every whisper, every sighting, every strange hum in the cane was a reminder that what had been buried refused to stay dead. That the history they tried to erase had written itself into the wind. When the 20th century arrived, the old plantations became oil fields, refineries, highways. The poles with the skulls were long gone, replaced by telephone lines. But people still avoided walking those roads after dark. Truckers said their radios cut out between La Place and Destrehan. Fishermen spoke of seeing fog that glowed from within. And only a few said they'd seen the march again. One, a retired worker in the 1960s, told a journalist, "It was just after midnight. The levee was low from the rain. I saw men walking where the water met the grass. No sound, no shadow, just movement like the river was remembering itself." The journalist laughed, wrote it off as folklore. But that same night, his tape recorder, brand new, jammed, and every reel was blank. In the archives, the rebellion ends in 1811. In the hearts of the people, it never did. Each generation inherits its own haunting. And on the German coast, that haunting was legacy. The march became a symbol, the Phantom Regiment a warning, and the land itself a witness. They say if you walk those roads under a full moon, and the air grows still, and you hear the faint rhythm of feet in the mud, don't look back. Because history walks both ways, and sometimes it recognizes you. The century turned. The plantations changed hands, and still the land refused to rest. By the time Reconstruction began, the German coast had a new name: St. John the Baptist Parish, St. Charles Parish, Jefferson Parish. But beneath those titles, the soil was the same roots, the same ghosts, the same unspoken fear that what once rose from the cane might rise again. The fact layer begins here in the thin, cracked pages of the Freedmen's Bureau reports, written between 1865 and 1870. Their handwriting was shaky, the ink often blotted by humidity. Yet in those government records meant to be dry, statistical forgettable, there are lines that still hum. Local superstition among freed people suggests that the cane men walk on the levees when mist is low. Several former slaves refuse to work near old plantations, citing marching shadows at dusk. Children have been heard chanting an unfamiliar hymn, reference to rebellion not confirmed. At first glance, these seem like rumors, folklore written into bureaucracy. But between the margins, you sense the unease of the investigators, men sent to enforce order, yet unable to explain what the locals knew by heart. That the rebellion was not only history, it was presence. Newspapers tried to domesticate it, to turn it into cautionary tale. The New Orleans Picayune called it the mad revolt of the German coast. Church leaders reframed it as divine punishment. But the freed people, they reclaimed it in song. Listen closely to old spirituals recorded along the Mississippi in the early 1900s, songs that never appear in hymn books. There's one that goes, "River don't sleep, river don't lie. Them men still walk where the cane grow high." Another sung in slow cadence by women who picked cotton generations later. "Charles, light the fire. Lord, let it burn, carry my name down the river's turn." Music became their archive, their coded scripture of survival. What the record erased, the rhythm remembered. By 1875, missionaries documented what they called strange night ceremonies among freed black congregations near Edgard and Laplace. They described singing and trances fire carried in bowls and prayers directed toward the river. They condemned it as superstition, a vestige of African paganism. But oral historians now recognize it as something else, a remembrance ritual. A secret memorial to the uprising that the law forbade them to speak of. Each January, elders would gather before dawn. They would light small fires not large enough to be seen from the road and whisper the names that weren't supposed to exist. No sermons, no drums, no tears. Just the sound of fire-eating air and the faint chorus of a phrase that appeared in multiple testimonies. "We still march." Those were the forbidden services of the cane walkers. Even the children were told not to watch. They said the dead didn't like to be looked at directly. The fact layer continues deeper now, through letters written by army officers sent to suppress unrest among freed people during Reconstruction. Captain Harlan, stationed near Norco, wrote to his superiors in 1871, "There is unease among the Negro workers. They gather at night on the riverbank, facing the water, silent until sunrise. No violence has occurred, but the locals call it Deslon's Watch. No violence, only silence. Yet silence was enough to frighten those who built their comfort on forgetting. Later that same year, his replacement, Lieutenant Bowen, reported an incident during a patrol. While crossing the levee road, we encountered what appeared to be a procession and or 12 individuals holding torches. Upon approach, torches vanished. No sign of retreat. Ground left wet, though no rain had fallen. That account was marked unverified. Filed away, forgotten like the rebellion itself. But in the folklore, it grew. By the 1880s, old freedmen told their grandchildren that the Cane men no longer walked alone. That when thunder came rolling from the west, when lightning flashed across the river, they could see others among them. Women, children, drummers with no drums, only motion. And sometimes a tall man at the front, half shadow, half flame. They called him the driver that wouldn't die. Some said he was Charles returned walking every January to count the dead. Others said he was something older, a spirit of the river itself, drawn to the fire of the uprising. Then came the 20th century, and with it, industry. Oil, gas, steel. The fields where cane once grew turned into refineries, their pipes glistening where stalks once stood. Smoke replaced fog machinery, replaced rhythm. But the folklore refused to vanish. Workers at the new plants told of cold spots near the levee of machines that stalled on still nights of a hum that rose from nowhere. A foreman in 1922 wrote in his log, "No wind, no sound. Pressure gauges trembling as if something beneath the tanks is moving. Felt like footsteps, steady even." He signed his entry simply J.D. Norco. The next day, he was transferred. In that same decade, a writer named Lyle Saxon, one of Louisiana's folklorists, traveled the German coast collecting ghost stories for the Louisiana Writers Project. He recorded an elderly woman named Aunt Millie, who told him, "They say the march don't stop. Every January when the moons shine on the river, them men come back. You can't see 'em with your eyes, only feel 'em in your chest. That beat ain't drums, it's their hearts still going." When Saxon published his book, the story was reduced to a paragraph, "Negro superstition haunted levee." The rest, the rhythm, the grief, the defiance was cut. But Aunt Millie's recording still exists. Scratchy, ghostly, her voice breaking between laughter and something like fear. You can hear her hum the tune that she said belonged to the march. It lasts only 6 seconds. Then the tape ends with static. Meanwhile, scholars began to chase what she called the march. In 1938, historian Alcée Fortier traced the descendants of those executed in 1811. He found families who had no written genealogy, only oral threads. A woman named Clara Joseph told him, "My granddaddy say we from them who tried to walk to New Orleans. He say our blood don't rest till it reach the city." She had never read a history book, but she had the story memorized. Fact and folklore had fused inseparable, indivisible. What couldn't be proven lived on in testimony, the most human archive of all. In the 1960s, when the civil rights movement surged through the South, the old song surfaced again, this time as protest chants. Historians recorded activists in New Orleans adapting the rhythm of the river Don't Sleep spiritual, turning it into freedom don't sleep, freedom don't lie. No one in the movement knew it came from 1811. But the rhythm remembered. The march had changed clothes from cane fields to city streets, but its heartbeat was the same. And beneath all that, the folklore layer too deepened into dream. Local pastors began reporting vision testimonies. A woman in St. Charles Parish claimed she saw men made of smoke walking along the levee during a flood. A farmer's child spoke of hearing singing in her sleep songs in a language like rain. She drew shapes in the dirt lines like soldiers, a river flowing through them. Her teacher burned the drawings. The dreams came to be called the Walker's Calling. People said if you dreamed of the march 3 nights in a row, you had ancestors among them. Some treated it as blessing, others as curse. But all agreed once you heard the rhythm, you could never unhear it. modern historians piecing through letters, maps, oral tales, see it now not just as haunting, but as continuity. A rebellion that didn't die, but diffused into religion, into music, into resistance. From the hush harbors of Reconstruction to the gospel choirs of the 1930s, from the marches on Selma to the chants in New Orleans, the cadence is traceable. It's the same pacing, the same breaths, the same rising and falling between hope and dread. The fact layer, too, ends in archives. The folklore layer, too, ends in hearts. Together they form what Louisiana's Creole elders call mémoire du sang, the memory of blood. A memory that travels through generations, like a river through time. And if you stand by that river tonight, the one that once saw heads on poles, that once ran red and silent, you can almost feel the current shifting beneath the surface. Like breath. Like waiting. Like the pause before a voice rises again to finish what was never completed. The wind changes again. After 2 centuries, it still does that quietly, without warning, as if something unseen shifts beneath the surface of the land. Louisiana's river towns hum with engines now. Oil refineries blink like steel constellations. The old cane rows are gone. But the silence, the same silence that followed the rebellion, still lingers like a second sky above the Mississippi. At night, the lights along the levee flicker, just for a moment, and the air thickens. That's when the locals say they come back. It's easy to dismiss. Easy to blame fog, wind, memory, imagination. But the deeper you look into the archives, the oral testimonies, the sound recordings, the harder it is to explain what shouldn't exist, yet does. In 1994, a team of Louisiana State University researchers recorded audio samples from the German Coast Levee near Destrehan, part of a project to document environmental sound memory. At 3:11 a.m., the recording picked up rhythmic thuds. 3 beats. A pause. Then 3 again. Not random, not mechanical, not natural. The waveform was later compared to historical reenactments of marching cadence from early 19th century African military traditions. The match was 87%. The report was filed quietly into a university database labeled Unexplained Rhythmic Anomaly. It never reached publication, but long before modern instruments tried to measure it, the people already knew. A Creole historian named Henriette Toussaint once said, "In Louisiana, ghosts don't haunt houses, they haunt time." And maybe that's what happened here. Maybe time never healed. It just looped, circling back every January to remind the living that the past still breathes. One night in 2003, a filmmaker named Julien Baptiste camped near La Place, hoping to capture fog footage for a documentary on Louisiana folklore. At dawn, his camera caught something. His eyes didn't faint, figures moving along the waterline, silhouettes fading in and out of mist. No clear faces, no color, just form and motion. They moved in rows, slow, deliberate, like a march. When the footage was enhanced, the thermal sensors showed cooler temperatures along those lines, as if the air itself carried shape. Julien died in 2009. His film was never finished. The recovered footage, 11 seconds long, circulates quietly in local history circles under the name The German Coast Shadows. But beyond the cameras, the sensors, the science, there are still those who carry it in blood. In 2011, the bicentennial of the rebellion descendants gathered on the riverbank for the first official public commemoration. They wore white. They carried torches. They sang. And as they began to walk, tracing the same 50-mile route their ancestors had taken toward New Orleans, something strange happened. Halfway through the march, the wind turned against them, sudden and fierce, as though the river itself exhaled. The torches flickered, and for a few moments the crowd fell silent. Someone said they heard drums faint beneath the wind. Others swore they felt the ground tremble. A child began to cry, saying, "They're walking with us." When dawn came, the air was still heavy electric. The march ended, but no one spoke for a long time. One woman, a teacher from St. John Parish, later said, "I don't believe in ghosts, but something marched with us that night. Something wanted to be seen again. And that's the bridge, the invisible current between 1811 and now. 2 centuries apart, same soil, same river, same rhythm. Because history doesn't end when the ink dries. It ends when people stop listening. And Louisiana never stopped listening. The fact layer and the folklore layer begin to blur here, indistinguishable like 2 reflections merging in river light. The fact layer shows us letters, journals, trial reports, songs, evidence of the rebellion's fire, its suppression, its erasure. The folklore layer whispers what those documents couldn't. That rebellion was not buried, it was absorbed. That every torch extinguished was reborn in a hymn, a heartbeat, a storm. That no revolution ever truly dies, it only changes frequency. During the 2020 Louisiana Slave Rebellion reenactment, a performance meant to restore memory, participants described sensations no script could stage. One reenactor said, "When we crossed the levee, I felt pressure in my chest like someone behind me breathing in sync. I turned around, no one there, but I swear I wasn't alone." Another, an older man, said, "We were supposed to stop at the river bend, but I kept hearing steps going farther. I think they finally reached the city." No cameras caught it, no proof. But witnesses described the same thing. Footsteps after silence. That's when the idea of haunting starts to collapse. Because what if it isn't haunting at all? What if it's memory replaying itself, refusing to fade? Every flood, every storm, every January wind, not supernatural, but ancestral. A living feedback loop between what was lost and what remains. The archives say the rebellion lasted 2 days. The folklore says it never ended. And now the evidence from sound recordings to songs to DNA and oral memory all begin to suggest the same thing. The rebellion became Louisiana itself. Every storm, every parade, every second line in New Orleans echoes of that march. Every drum in Congo Square descendant of that rhythm. Every protest that rose in the South child of that defiance. It's not haunting, it's continuity. In one last archive box, deep inside the Louisiana Historical Center, lies a page almost no one reads. It's unsigned, undated, written in faded French. "I saw them from my window, the men from the fields. I think they march for all of us now. I think they will never stop." It's not clear who wrote it, maybe a witness, maybe a survivor. But the handwriting trembles, like it was written while listening. And that brings us here to this moment, to the bridge, where time folds in on itself. The night of January 1811 collapses into the night of now. The fire in the cane becomes the hum of power lines. The torches become streetlights. The songs become engines' drums and voices calling names that history tried to silence. Somewhere between the old river and the new one, between the living and the forgotten, they march still. Maybe not in flesh, maybe not in sound, but in every breath of wind that crosses the levee, in every heartbeat that remembers injustice, in every voice that refuses to whisper when it should shout. And that is the climax history never wrote. The moment the ghosts stopped being ghosts and became memory made visible. In Louisiana, they have a saying, old half, in French half, in Creole l'esprit du fleuve ne dort jamais. The spirit of the river never sleeps. Maybe that's why when night falls along the Mississippi and the fog rolls low, the people here still pause before speaking. They know the air carries echoes. They know the land has memory. And they know if they listen long enough, they might just hear the march again. The river runs quiet now. Or at least that's what they say. But listen long enough, and you'll hear it beneath the hum of highways, beneath the whisper of cane that grows wild at the water's edge. There's still a pulse. Faint. Steady. Endless. 2 centuries after the rebellion, the land has changed. Faces, plantations turned into petrochemical corridors, slave quarters into museums, history into display. And yet, nothing truly rests. Every January, when the air thickens and the fog rolls in from the river, the ground feels soft again, like it remembers the weight of footsteps. Locals don't walk near the levee those nights. They say the wind feels crowded. Officially, the German Coast Rebellion of 1811 remains a footnote in American history. A failed uprising swiftly suppressed, limited in scope. But that's what happens when history is written by those who survived comfort, not courage. The archives measure numbers. The river measures consequence. And the river, unlike the archive, never lies. For decades, textbooks reduced the uprising to a paragraph. But stories live longer than books. The people who carried it through song, through whispers, through silence, became the unwritten authors of a deeper truth. That rebellion was not an episode, it was an inheritance. Every movement that came after every shout for freedom, every march, every song of defiance carries a drop of that same river in its voice. Selma, Montgomery, Ferguson, New Orleans. The names change, the rhythm doesn't. In 2019, an artist named Dred Scott recreated the 1811 march 50 miles from the plantations to New Orleans. Hundreds of people dressed in 19th century clothes walked together. No weapons, only torches, chants, and drums. The same route, the same ground, the same air that once carried smoke and terror, now carried song. And when they reached the city, they did what Charles Deslandes and his people never lived to do. They raised their torches high. They shouted to the sky. They finished the march. People cried not out of sadness, but recognition. For a moment, time folded. The past stepped through the present. The river sighed, and history for once exhaled. But even that, beautiful as it was not closure. Because some stories don't end, they echo. Every January, since descendants gather along the German coast, they light small fires at dawn, just like their ancestors did. They don't sing loudly. They don't preach. They just stand in the fog and whisper names that no book will print. A roll call of the forgotten spoken softly, so the river can hear. Some say if you stand among them, you can feel the air vibrate like the earth itself answering back. Some say that's imagination. But those who've been there, they never call it imagination twice. And then there are the songs. The old spirituals once sung in secret have evolved, gospel choirs, hip-hop samples, jazz riffs, all carrying the same refrain. Still we rise. The rebellion's pulse found new instruments. It became rhythm and language, poetry and protest, a code passed through time. It hides in soundtracks and sermons, in children's laughter, in the drumming of rain on tin roofs. You may not notice it, but it notices you. Because once a song like that begins, it doesn't stop. It travels, it migrates, it haunts, it lives. Some say ghosts fade when they're remembered. But here, remembrance keeps them awake. Maybe that's what they wanted all along, not peace, not vengeance, just acknowledgement. A name spoken aloud, a march finished, a history faced. In 1811, they were called rebels. In truth, they were prophets. They saw what America didn't want to see. That freedom built on silence is no freedom at all. They carried the fire forward across centuries through the voices of the living. And every time someone says, "I can't breathe," the river replies, "I know." Because it's been holding that breath since 1811. Now, look again at the river. The one that carried sugar and bodies, commerce and grief. The one that tried to bury its own reflection. See how it bends, slow, patient, endless. It doesn't forget where it's been. It doesn't rush to forgive. It simply carries everything. That's what history does too. It carries. Even when we try to dam it. Even when we build over it. Even when we swear it's gone. Some nights the wind on the levee sounds like whispering. Other nights like marching. And if you listen closely, you'll hear it. The same cadence that began 200 years ago. Not ghosts, not superstition, just memory alive, restless walking. So before this story fades to black, take a moment. Look around you. Where are you watching from? What time is it now where you are? Because if you're still here, still listening, then the march continues through you. They tried to erase it. But history has a heartbeat, and it's still walking down the river road. This was the rebellion they tried to erase. And though the names are gone, the echo remains, always.